Hello and greetings, boxing fans. This is the Historical Boxing Society podcast. Today, we are exploring the beginning of the Queensbury rules and boxing's first mobster, Larry Foley. Foley operated as a trio with also boxing legend Jem Mace and their business partner, Jack Thompson. And today we're going to explore the beginnings of both Larry Foley and the beginning of Jem Mace as we do readings of several different subjects here. So this is how Larry Foley returned to Sydney. So he was born in New Wales in 1849. At the age of 3, they moved to Sydney, and at 14, he moved to Wollongong to become a Catholic priest, which never really materialized. Very much like, Dick O'Brien. He was a boxer that was also trying to get into priesthood and, of course, failed. At the age of 20, Larry Foley returned to Sydney. Now, this is the very beginning of his story. He worked as a building laborer and eventually a subforeman and then a building contractor. In his youth in Sydney, he joined a Catholic gang known as the Greens, the Green Street Fighting Gang, often fighting rival members of the Orange Protestant group. His very first fight, lasting 71 rounds, is believed to have been on March 18th, 1871, against Sandy Ross, a leader of the Orange Gang, which only ended when the police stopped the fight. He was known as the captain of the push after the Rock Push Street Gang in Sydney. Eventually, they got a rematch, and Larry Foley proved victorious over Sandy Ross. That was the very beginning of Larry Foley's mob career as he grew up in the gang, and eventually they formed a mob in the streets of Australia, and this is the very beginning of his income flow, which he funneled into several businesses. And the most of which would be, let's see here. By 1879, Foley was managing 2 Sydney hotels. This is all from money he acquired as the gang leader. The very first was the United States Hotel, and then came the White Horse, which was on George Street, and the hotel was in front and a gymnasium in the rear of the hotel. One of his responsibilities was tending bar at his hotels, though unlike many of his fellow boxers, he was a telltale by most accounts. After his victory over Hicken, Foley opened a boxing academy at his White Horse Hotel on George Street, though he likely held matches there earlier. Former English champion Jem Mace, who trained Foley for his championship bout with Hicken, helped open the school and continued as an instructor. At his gym at the White Horse, Foley taught, trained, and guided the careers of great boxers like Young Griffo, Bob Fitzsimmons, Paddy Slavin, and Peter Jackson, as well as the lesser-known Dan Creedon and George Dawson. He was known worldwide for the quality of his boxing training, and he acted as a promoter as well at times, helping mold the careers of most of the gifted students of his academy, such as Bob Fitzsimmons, who became a champion in 3 weight classes. Before we begin with the stories of Jem Mace here from our readings, I just thought this would be a perfect time to read from an article. This is the very beginning of Foley's first pupil, is the account of when he meets Peter Jackson. As Jackson was certainly right towards the beginning of the career of him as a boxing teacher. And Jackson, as it's explained in the book, really his real first boxing lessons that he thought was the most valuable was actually watching a Jem Mace spar. That's where he said he took most of his beginning information. And we are going to do a reading right here of the day he met Peter Jackson. As Peter Jackson just arrived from the shore from a clipper ship, and he was with his friend as they made their way to the Larry Foley, and he wanted a different form of employment as he hated being on the ship, and he wanted to become a boxer. So this is the story as we read here. "Glory be God," said Larry Foley. "Jem taught me all that I knew about boxing. One evening in Larry's saloon, all eyes turned to look at the quietly dressed young stranger who entered. His color attracted attention. He was a tall Negro. "Mr. Foley, sir," said the stranger, "I have a letter to you. My name is Peter Jackson. I have come from the West Indies, and I would like you to give me a tryout." Mr. Foley, who was seated with Mr. Gerald and Mr. Joe Thompson, the wealthy bookmaker, rose and said, "How do you do, Peter Jackson? Let me introduce myself. My name is Larry Foley." Then he introduced his friends, remarking as he did so that there was no color barrier there. The next morning, with only a few privileged onlookers, Larry gave the newcomer a tryout he had asked for. "Hit me in the face," he said, with a sly wink at Frank Gerald, and Peter Jackson promptly did so as he was told. Twice he hit Larry Foley in the face, much to Gerald's satisfaction. Then the master asked the pupil to take off the gloves and stand against the wall, and drop your hands to your side, he added. It was then that he saw that the hollows of Peter Jackson's palms fell over his knees. From that day on, for 12 months, the gentleman Negro, as he became to be known, made his home at Larry Foley's gym. And one day, another fine athlete figure, tall and powerful, came in, a white man named Frank Patrick Slavin, who had just finished a fencing contract up in Queensland, splitting logs and driving posts into the ground to help develop his well-shaped muscles, and he was aching up for a fight, wanted to take up the game. Larry Foley introduced him to Peter Jackson, and there in Larry Foley's gym, Peter taught Frank Slavin all that there was to know about fighting. Both of them made world names for themselves, and the fights they had with each other at the National Sporting Club in London was said to have been the greatest ever fought there. Peter Jackson, who was the heavier by 12 pounds, won in the 11th round. In the opinion of Frank Gerald, who saw the contest, the exhibition of scientific fighting given by Jackson that night has never been surpassed, and stamped him as the greatest fighter of his era. Okay, so that was the night that Peter Jackson met one Larry Foley. Now we are going to go a little farther back in time, as we are going to learn the very beginning of how the trio formed between Jem Mace, Larry Foley, and of course Jack Thompson, the promoter, as we're going to take you through the very beginning. This is the story of Jem Mace. Mace was born on April 8th, 1831, in a little village of Bessatone, Norfolk. He was an accomplished fiddler and dancer with a chronic dislike for manual labor. Jem also suffered from a deep-rooted wanderlust as the result. He traveled the roads around England from fairground to market towns, earning a meager living with his tunes and jigs. He learned his boxing in the hard school of pub fights and carnival tents as he drifted around the country and acquired a reputation as a real snag for any unsuspecting town bully. It was 1841 that Mace found himself in Yarmouth, not a penny to his pocket and a very empty stomach. He took up a position outside a small pub and started to tune his fiddle when he set upon 3 burly sailors, who, for a lark, smashed his violin. Mace, at this time, was 18 years old, rock-hard and fit. He had been fighting fisticuffs, so he knew his stuff. Needless to say, he dealt out a severe thrashing to 2 of the seamen. The third bolted when it was his turn to face the ferocious fiddler. Mace was later to acknowledge that the seamen had inadvertently done him a favor, for it was a result of this little dust-up that Mace decided to become a full-time pugilist, a career that would last on and off for 50 years. June 1861, Mace became champion of England when he defeated Strawberry infant Samhurst, who was 6 feet inches tall and 6 stones heavier than Mace. Jem was by today's welterweight. He stood 5'9" tall and weighed about 11 stones, yet his skills were such that he could defeat much bigger men with ease. Mace was smart enough to realize that his size and weight were of little use him in the mauling stakes, so he avoided wrestling and the roughhouse side of the prize ring, which most fighters relied upon. By keeping his distance, he was able to cut his opponents to shreds, with classic straight punches as they rushed in to grapple. Most of these tactics Mace never loved, but some members of the fancy, such as Tom Sawyers. In fact, many diehards considered Mace a cowardly fighter, while later generations came to regard him as the father of modern boxing. By 1866, there were fewer men of quality for Jem to fight. The pressure of the prize ring from the authorities was growing, and many of England's finest had headed for the rich nurseries of America. So Mace followed. He traveled all around the United States and Canada for many years, beating the best of the men available and giving exhibitions, and generally acknowledged as the prize ring champion of the world. While in America, Mace heard glowing reports from travelers and gold prospectors of a brilliant fighting man in Australia named Larry Foley. So consistent were these reports that Jem decided to travel to the great southern colony and make Foley's acquaintance in Sydney. Upon arrival at the harbor city in March of 1877, Mace was greeted with great warmth and enthusiasm by the prominent members of the fancy. No time was wasted before he was quickly introduced to the champion of the green, Larry Foley. Now they describe him as the champion of the green because the green was the gang that Larry Foley was running. So this is March 1877. There was an instant rapport between Mace and Foley. Both men were dark and handsome with a flair for elegant clothes and being almost identical in size and weight with this striking couple. Apart from Jem's receding hairline and Larry's wavy locks, they could have been brothers. Mace was 46 and Foley was 28, but their meeting that day and the warm handshake exchange between them sealed on the gold age of Australian boxing. Jem Mace had made his name and reputation in the prize ring, but long advocated for the use of gloves as a more gentlemanly approach to boxing since the Sayers Heaney bout. With the advent of Queensbury rules code, Jem was quick to establish and promote it in all his sparring and exhibitions in England and America. But to this time, his conversation rate had been practically nil. Upon meeting Foley, Mace immediately saw the Australian as a means to spread the gospel of Queensbury in the southern continent. That is, if he was good as Sydney sidewinders claimed, but it wasn't long before a spar was organized between the two. Mace was unable to persuade Foley at the exhibition to be held at the Capitol. So Larry Foley, along with Jack Thompson and his brother Jim Thompson, combined with Jem Mace, and they formed the trio of the Jim, which resided in the back of the white horse. And it is there where they were big proponents of sparring, as private matches were held nonstop. None of these private matches would appear in the Australian newspaper, as they were done in private, and very heavy betting was done, as multiple fights happen that are not dictated in history, such as Frank Slavin versus Joe Goddard and Bob Fitzsimmons against Peter Jackson. All of these matches happened in private, as bets were done upon the fight. As the gym became more and more famous in the mid-1870s and started producing some of the very finest of Australian fighters. As I stated in the beginning article, it was Peter Jackson and Frank Slavin at the very beginning as a launch, and by 1878 is when Peter Jackson invaded America. The gym first opened in 1871, so just a matter of by the mid-1870s, it was prominent. All the big names were there. And in a very beginning article, John L. Sullivan visited Australia to get a look at the up-and-rising fighters of the Australian. And upon viewing them up in person, he wanted nothing to do with them, as he hung out in Australia and did his vaudeville shows, as he was making substantial money doing that, but he was getting laughed off the stage in Australia. He got a very sour reception, as he was playing a rather poor person, and the audience was not buying it, as he appeared rather rich and dressed as such. John L. Sullivan finally left Australia, as he hitched a ride Joe Choyinski, and he explained to Joe Choyinski how disappointed he was in his encounter with Australia, and Joe Choyinski also had some severe disappointment, as he faced one of the Australians' best fighters in Joe Goddard, and had very little success against the barrier champion Joe Goddard. So by the summer of 18 1878 is when the Australian fighters started invading into America. Peter Jackson was the first, as he was looking to challenge John L. Sullivan, as Sullivan had returned from Australia, and I would say winter of 1877 or so, maybe the spring of 1878. But nonetheless, Jackson had no luck in trying to lure a match with John L. Sullivan, and he settled upon the next greatest fighter of the time, which was George Godfrey. Shortly after the match between Jackson and Godfrey, which is in July of 1878, the very next month was the next Australian to invade America in Tom Lees, and then came several others as the Australian invasion was in full force, as they had huge amounts of pupils, and unlike the Americans, the Australians spent countless hours sparring, as the Americans were more idle, and they grew quite rusty by staying out of the ring for long periods of time. And Larry Foley was at the very beginning, as he pushed the Queensbury rules, as his gloved fighters came over into America, and all the major fights were done of the Queensbury rules. And Larry Foley had great premonition, as he was backed by one of the fisticuff champions in Jem Mace. And it didn't take long, just the beginning of 1878, that the three of them started making newspaper headlines, getting arrested. Jack Thompson, Jem Mace, and of course Larry Foley. This was just a matter of about a year past when they met, and by that time they were in full force as troublemaking fellas. So 1879 is when the gym started, and Larry Foley's gym, and it took about 3-4 years, and the fighters from many areas such as New Zealand and such were all migrating into Australia to fight under the new versions of Queensbury rules and the boxing's biggest academy, which was ran in the backside of the White Horse Hotel on George Street. But there were several other places where they were also fighting. Just George Street Hotel was the private events, but there were public events happening at other locations. And that was the very beginning of boxing's first mobster in Larry Foley, one of the beginning teachers of the beginning of Queensbury rules in boxing. And along with his partner, Jem Mace, they formed some of the greatest boxers of all times, as the Australian had boatloads of success against the Americans. The first big match was Jackson beating Godfrey. Shortly thereafter was Frank Slavin absolutely shellacking Jake Kilrain, which was the top American at the time. As the reports from the fight state, Frank Slavin was hitting him with such force in the stomach that the shots could be heard outside the arena on the street. As Slavin was just an ultimate fighting force, just absolutely destroying Jake Kilrain. And of course, then came the trifecta in Bob Fitzsimmons, who won the middleweight title from Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, as all of the Australians were enjoying substantial success against the best that America had to offer, and they were dominating them. And that's the story of the beginning of Jem Mace, Larry Foley, and their business partner, Jack Thompson, as I use all kinds of pictures in here to help paint you a picture of the very beginning of the Queensbury run.